everybody. Thanks for joining me today. This is Sarah's Imagination Corner, and I am Sarah. I got a treat for you today. So, I'm going to be reading Maiden of Sugarplum Hollow. Now, this is a little bit of a... So, you might want to get a blanket, maybe some warm hot cocoa, something that makes you feel safe, so you won't get too scared. But anyways, now, do you know what an urban legend is? An urban legend is a story that is passed down from generation to generation. Meaning that, say somebody's grandpa told them a story, and then his grandpa told him, and then his grandma told him, and his aunt and uncle, and they told you. So what happens is each story that is told to you, the future generations add to that story. And when it makes its way to you, guess what it's called? Urban legend. Now, most urban legends are based on myths and things that maybe aren't true. But then you have some of the urban legends that are true. So let's get started. Now, I grew up in Kentucky in the late 80s, and well, actually the early 80s. I was a little girl in the early 80s. And I lived in a very small country, a small area that was so minute that you couldn't even see it on a map. And I lived up this long, winding hollow, or holler is what we called it. Okay, now, when I was a child, I had a wild, vivid imagination, and I loved to tell stories and sit around a campfire and spooky stories and scare people, because that was just fun. I don't know, I like to do it. So anyways, you could kind of call me the storyteller of the family, because my wild imagination kept me telling stories all the time. Now, when I was a little girl, I loved to go and talk to the old timers that lived around me. And they would tell me stories that happened to them when they were little kids. And then guess what I would do? I would add to the stories to make an urban legend. Now, some of this truth, some of this book is truth, some of it is just a myth. But you be the judge of that. So, I can remember the air that day. It was hot and sticky, and there was a stale smell that cascaded over the mountains. I decided to take a walk along my dark hollow to visit the elderly couple that lived near me. I did this quite often. I would walk down there, and then we would walk down to his huge walnut tree and we'd crack walnuts to eat. Now, he would tell me stories, and I would tell him stories too. But he told me a story once, and it stayed in my mind. And it's as fresh in my mind as the day that it was told. Now, high above a small road called Sugarplum, a towering rock loomed in the distance. Now, this rock had fallen from another mountain above it 100 years ago. And this was common in the southern areas. It had a lot of rain in the summer, and the mud, because of all the rain, would become clay. And that was slick. So you can imagine walking up those mountains. You would slip and slide. So when I would lay in bed at night, when I was a little girl, I'd look out my window. I'd see them huge mountains and these huge rocks and caves that surrounded me. And my fear was that one of them rocks one day would slide down and hit our trailer. It never happened, but it happened in the case of Sugarplum Hollow. Now, it was a very quiet, sleepy town that I grew up in. And it had wandering hills, and there was sun-kissed trees. And the trees were so close to the sun because the mountains were so high that it looked like sun rays would dance off the side of the leaves. It was beautiful. Now, the earth was subtle, but it had an oddness. It was a place of peace, but yet there was a place of strangeness too. And it was mysterious, but yet welcoming. Now, I experienced and saw things that went on behind those trees that I'll never forget. And I'll never forget my time spent there. Now, Sugarplum Hollow was one of the narrowest hollows in the middle of two enormous mountains. Now, it was perfectly nestled sweetly in between them, almost as if it had been painted in. Now, the hollow was so small that a car couldn't even fit up the hollow. So if you wanted to go looking around or trying to find things, explore things, you know how you had to go? You had to go by foot. Now, there was rumors that circulated above that rock and about Sugarplum Hollow. There was so many rumors. And there was rumors about what lurked in those deep southern mountains. Words that would dance off the old-timers' lips, and it would frighten generations, and kids would be afraid that it was truth. Now, it would cause their minds to wander and their hearts to race as they slept. Now, the rumors about this mysterious rock and what went on behind the rock when all of us were asleep, what could be wandering around those lonely mountains, possibly lurking inside the windows. Something that all of us tried to avoid. And there was terrified grown men who wouldn't even walk up that hollow at night. But it seems like the kids always did. Now, that enormous rock that fell from them other mountains was nicknamed the Indian Rock. Now, it was called the Indian Rock because inside of it was a cave. And there was fossils and there was markings all over the wall. Now, what's cool about this is that it was always said that those markings were perhaps part of rituals that happened late in another era in history. And they were painted so deep on the rock surface. And they told us stories of the past. Most of the time we couldn't understand those stories, but they still told us stories of the past with pictures and markings and things like that. Now, Sugarplum Hollow was known to habitat some of the strangest people. And they were said to be mutant-like creatures. They resembled humans, but maybe from like a different era in history. Possibly like caveman type of creatures, and they have a groaning of melodic tones, and they had screeches. Perhaps these creatures are someone that could one day habitat. They could live with those who lived up those mountains. Perhaps they were some type of forgotten tribe, and they had found the secrets of the mountains. Now, I wanted to search that hollow, and I wanted to explore what others may be too frightened to see or to find out. I wanted to be the one to prove it truth or prove it false. So I loved walking in those mountains. It was a child's dream come true. Now there was a cleanness in the air, and there was always the aroma of some syrupy honeysuckles that were hanging along the vines. And we would eat the honey that was inside the honeysuckles. So I always needed that fresh air in my lungs, and I needed something new. Perhaps I could meet somebody, I could meet a new friend. Now, those that habitated and lived in ways up that holler that would make city folk gasp for air. It was country at its finest. There was towering rocks and trees, and they looked as if they were a stairway to heaven. And the heavens surrounded by the mist of clouds. And I decided today would be the day that I would go exploring alone. I'd been struggling with things at home and at school, and I needed time to clear my mind and my thoughts. Now, I needed time to escape from the world around me. And when I needed time to escape, what I would do is I would go and wander alone in those dark mountains. Now, when things seemed too complicated, I would always try to get away and try to wander through the mountains, and I loved to look at the trees, and I loved to view the earth around me. And it was an extraordinary place for a perfect getaway. My perfection was in nature and the creation that God had made. I would find what others denied to be true. And I would never forget the day in those mountains, I would find something or someone that would change my mind forever. Now, I set my alarm really early that morning, and it blared at 6 o'clock. And I fumbled to shut off the loud blaring sound which echoed in and out of my ears. I didn't want to wake my brother or my sister. I slid out of bed silently, and I slowly fumbled to get dressed. I wiped the sleep out of my eyes, and I gazed at the magnificent sun that was slowly emerging above the horizon. The sun kissing the mountains good morning with its friendliness. Now the clouds were already high in the sky, and if it had been painted, it looked as if it was painted just for me by God. And it was a perfect masterpiece, the sky and the clouds and the trees. It was such a pleasant day, and such a pleasant day looked outside my window. There was so much for me to explore. The lofty trees and the cotton candy clouds were so welcoming to me. And the birds singing in harmony sounded like a bird orchestra outside my window. My older sister and brother were still in their sweet slumber, and I watched as their chests rose and fell in perfect harmony with one another. And I peeked into my parents' room, and I saw them sleeping like spoons, snuggled tightly together in their bed. The hooting melody of the morning dove would dance around the windows. It would then dance in the air, twisting and turning, the house in perfect calmness, only the humming of the earth. Now, the mornings were the finest moments of the day, especially in the summer months. It was as if the earth appreciated the way that the sun warmed it. The earth awoke up just for me. The earth opened its eyes just for me. I slowly put on my shorts, and I found my favorite shirt to wear. And I put on a pair of old holey socks, and I put them on my feet. And I grabbed my favorite red backpack, and I filled it with a couple snacks to eat along the way. The walk was long and draining, so I needed to have food to bring to keep my energy. The day that I would explore all that was Sugarplum Hollow. Now, I imagined that maybe I was a famous explorer, and I stood up straight as an arrow, the thoughts hopping in and out of my mind. And I welcomed all these thoughts, and I welcomed my great success. And I would go down in history for exploring, maybe be one of the earliest explorers of the Deep South, maybe the youngest and the bravest. I placed a peanut butter sandwich in a juice box and a large red apple in my bag, and I zipped the bag so slowly so that I wouldn't wake my family. Now, I put my blonde hair in a light-colored ponytail to keep it off my neck during my time-consuming hike. I brushed my teeth and made sure that I smelled okay, and you never knew who I was going to meet. Now, possibly, I could meet someone and I could bring them back, and I could introduce them to the whole world, and they would be my special friends. So, maybe everybody watches me and this unknown being held hands and we skipped along. Perhaps it'll be my new best friend. Now, I daydreamed about knowing that being and those beings that lived up that hollow, because I wanted to know if it was true. And those Kentucky summers were scorching hot, and a person could get overheated very quickly. So I made sure that I brought some water to hydrate me, and I went on my walk. Now, I walked down my crooked porch, had built last spring, and I hopped off the last step. The air was filled with fog and a honey, satisfying smell to it. Dew covered the trees and weighed down the small patches of grass in my lawn. I could feel the clamminess on my skin, and it caused goose pimples to appear all over my arms and up my back. And hefty stones and pieces of rock lay on the ground, and I would kick them slightly if they got in my way. I traveled down the large hill, and I looked up at the old neighbor's man house, and I stuck my tongue out at him because he was kind of creepy. Now, I counted my steps as I walked, and I felt nervous and eager, all rolled into a ball of emotion inside of me. Now my heart thudded quicker with each step I took, and adrenaline rushed my body. It was going to be a thrilling and beautiful day. I watched for a moment as ants carried pieces of food on their backs. They worked together. They carried old pieces of food, and they marched in a perfect long line down their holes, scurrying back to their queen. Now, I looked around at all the green trees, and there were so many birds that flew over my head. And I loved the way that the birds made long lines through the sky. And the sky had a slight pink kiss from the rising of the sun. The wind blew my hair and had a satisfying, sweet, sugary smell to it, and it tickled my nose. As I walked, it was a perfect painting. The Creator knew as he painted the heavens the perfect, crisp color of blue, and he dribbled green on the trees and the clouds so white, and they looked like cotton candy. It was a delightful, clear day. Now, Sugarplum Hollow and the shadowy Indian Rock was located a couple miles up the road. And I passed some of the neighbors' house on the way there, and there was this kid that used to bother me on the school bus, and he had long pointy hair that stuck straight up on his hair, and he had dirty ears, but I walked past his house, and I saw his old grandfather reading his newspaper. He was sitting on the porch in their old wood cabin, and I tried to tiptoe as quiet as a church mouse, and I saw a large chaw of tobacco in his mouth, and it puffed out his broad cheeks, and a small dribble of spit down his wiry lips. And he was a tall, plump man, and his trousers hardly covered his backside. Now, he never spoke to me. He just managed a few grunts and groans as he fumbled through his paper. He looked up at me, and he nodded. And I nodded and laughed. And the small community seemed to be at a standstill, except for a few dogs. You'd hear their stray barks, and they echoed past the mountains. Now, heavy-eyed, and the birds, they just had opened their eyes, and everything was still asleep. You know, that old man never really liked me much, and he also liked to spit. But anyways, I imagined that everybody was tightly tucked into their beds, and they were dreaming perhaps of what could be. And I walked at a slow, snail pace up the road, and I would trip now and then on huge potholes that were present in the road. The hotness from the pavement could already be felt on my feet. My shoes were very thin, so on the bottom I could already feel the hot asphalt that was starting to burn my toes. And the stench was hot, and it would make its way into the atmosphere. I heard cows, and I heard a few horses waking up, and they were stomping, and they were trotting around. Everything always sounded like an orchestra to me in the morning hours. The complete animal world sang in perfect melody with one another, a perfect choir. Now, I finally arrived at Sugarplum Hollow, and a small handwritten sign was nailed to an old pole that indicated that I finally reached my destination. Now, some of the letters were written backwards, so I figured it must be those hermits that wrote it, but that intrigued me even more. And I had never seen any of them myself. So maybe they were just imaginative creatures, or someone was playing a silly joke on me, perhaps. Maybe the kid down the street now. But perhaps they were forgotten by time. And maybe they only existed from the history lessons that I learned in school. Possibly animal creatures wandering along in the hills waited for their prey. Now I slowly turned up the twisting hop. It was extremely tight, and patches of briars grew over the hill. And large rocks lined, they were sideways, and stray vines of wildflowers encroached their way onto the old road. Now the colorful array of flowers danced up the large vine, and roses made their home on the briars that twirled up the walkway. They were striking in color. They were pink and blues with hints of purple too. Different animals scurried away from me, and they were running from my feet, hoping they could make their way home without death meeting them. Small snakes were scurrying about over the rocks, smelling with their tongues and greeting the awakening of the day. Now, legend had it that when one passed the bulky Indian rock, the stirring of branches and loud cackling sounds would be heard. It was said that the unknown dwellers would run up and down the hillside, hiding in between trees and bushes, just to watch as others trotted up the hollow. I could feel the feelings of strangling eyes staring at me as I walked further and further. Sounds stopping when you listen to them. This being an obvious indication that what lived up that rock had some form of intelligence. Now, they must have known if the mutants could stare at the trespassers as they walked by. Therefore, it must be someone or someone that was able to think of some sort of common sense and logic. Perhaps they were even smarter than us. Now, I wasn't sure if this legend was true, and I always heard noises as I would walk past that Indian rock. I would hear the rustling of the leaves and leaves breaking and branches falling and stuff. But I always thought maybe it was the wind, and the wind was blowing things, and every once in a while I would hear a howl. But I thought maybe that it was from the mountain lions that ran up inside those mountains. Now, there was a few times that I thought that I heard voices. Imagination has a way of running wild with the mind, and if we allow it, it can tease our mind and play with our senses, tickling our imagination, causing us to breathe deeper and your heart to beat quicker and quicker inside your chest. Now, it was said that they were giants because of their rumored non-typical height. You know, I had seen plenty of mountain folk, and they never harmed a soul. They lived peacefully and simply. However, these creatures were said not to be completely. Now, there was something up in those mountains. Something had to exist. Hill people did. However, whatever these things were, they were said to have big teeth that stuck out in large forehead and brows. Now, however, these giant animal-like creatures were said to resemble an animal-type creature, like I said before. And maybe, I don't know, maybe they evolved into something else. Maybe there was animal blood flowing through them. I don't know. Perhaps human and animal, interwoven and together in the veins of the mutants. Animal instinct, and possibly human emotion. Now, there was one before me that had decided to explore, and he had swore that he saw giants running through the mountains and claimed they let out of a peculiar sort of scream. He had been the only one to actually see them face to face, and no one else had ever been brave enough to allow the creatures to see them. They just usually ran. So they were too frightened to allow them to glance at their human face. But now, I was brave. believed the rumor and the legend. I knew that there was probably creatures that existed up in the mountains. And I didn't think it was an old wives' tale, and I didn't think it was an urban legend that had been passed down from generation. I just believed that it existed. So I knew in my heart that something lived and slept and ate up in that secret land near that Indian rock. I thought maybe they would accept me and they would want to know more about me and the human race, perhaps. Now, I tiptoed across the hollow below the large Indian rock, and I heard the rustling of small leaves and a loud crunch. Someone had to be in those woods. And I walked slowly, gazing up the large trees that were bending and swaying in the gentle wind. And the sun was now high above, and warm rays of light shone through the treetops. It looked beautiful to me, and it took my mind off the crackling sounds that I heard from branches. And I watched the rays dance on the leaves and the sun sparkling in the quiet parts of this place. You know, the sun almost looked more stunning and more alluring and even more mysterious. The earth that was under the rock was highly vegetated, and soil was dark and rich and the good stuff that farmers needed. And this place was quiet, peaceful, and warm. But yet a cool breeze danced through the trees. It was whistling and howling. I swallowed hard, and as the sounds grew louder and louder, and then it happened. I heard a moaning tone, and my heart beat quicker and quicker inside my chest, like the thudding of a bass drum. I felt so afraid and overwhelmed. I gazed up at that large rock, trying to be as quiet as a church mouse, and my body trembled with fear as my teeth started to chatter. I must not be as brave as I thought. I was afraid. I was downright terrified at that moment. I started to rethink about my exploration, and I started to wish that I slept in and not had been so nosy, and I was at home sleeping peacefully in my bed. Now, I feared that that creature may have been hiding in the thick brush hidden by dark trees. I looked closer and closer, and I swore I saw an image dance in and out of that sunlight. It seemed like every step it took passing the rock, the sounds grew louder and louder. And I heard a faint giggling sound like that of a child. The sounds echoed everywhere around the trees, and they were bouncing and they were surrounding the entire area. The sounds had kind of become part of the earth. They did not want to be seen. My thoughts about having a friendship began to fade. Now, I looked up, and I caught a glimpse of a slender young lady dancing in and out of the sunlight. Her hair looked lengthy, but it looked coarse, and I didn't want to believe my own eyes, and I blinked quickly, and I shook my head side to side, and I was in pure shock. Now, I tried to convince myself that it was a lonesome branch swaying in the gentle, deep wind. I stopped and listened once more. Now, for a moment, it was all tranquil, and I just heard the leaves twirling, and I closed my eyes tight. Now, and then suddenly a large, loud, cackling sound began. Now, somehow, whatever was up in them woods were communicating with one another using a piercing, clicking sound. The sounds now heard were that of a deeper tone, possibly that of a father or a man. Now, I stood there and I listened as the sounds became unison with one another, and they made an enchanted melody, almost like a song. Now, this was how they communicate with each other, and I was in a trance-like state, and and I was just in shock. So surrounded me were trees everywhere. This was their home. This was their protected place, and they did not want visitors. They did not want to be seen. I was frozen with horror and doubt, seeing and hearing things that others had not. Could this be true, or just maybe a silly prank? On the other hand, did a family live deep in the trees near the Indian Rock? Were they friendly? Are they angry at me? Could they be monsters? I didn't know what to believe. I was completely bewildered. Now, I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. And even though I was seeing it and I knew that something lived up in the mountains, I didn't want to believe it. It was exciting in the beginning to believe that life existed there. However, now being in front of this being, I was terrified. And I wondered if I'd be lunch. Now, my curiosity of this unknown being that lived among the trees soon took over the fear that I felt. And I mustered up strength and courage to climb that hill. And it led closer and closer to that rock. Now, I needed to see what was there. I was so afraid, dreadfully afraid. However, I would never forgive myself if I didn't see what was up there. So the curiosity would end up eating me up inside. Now, branches scraped my legs, and as I walked through the thick trees and brush, I felt wetness running down my socks and into my shoe, and it was blood from the scrape. Pushing forward, I had to see what this puzzling being was. My legs felt taut and worn out, and my body was sweating, and I felt wet from the sultry air, and my lengthy ponytail stuck to the back of my neck, and my eyes were red and teary. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. I just had to do it, though. I just had to. Maybe they were friendly and they didn't want to harm me. However, what if they weren't? Could it be an enchanted princess living in the trees waiting to be rescued from her prince? What were they anyways? Now, perhaps they wanted to meet me. Or maybe they needed rescue. It was a strong possibility that the family could be normal, right? And choose to live away from everybody, you know? Maybe they would invite me in for a cup of tea. Maybe they would want to know more about me. I just had to find out. So I walked closer and closer to the rock. And I heard a faraway laughter once more. And I struggled to make it to the top. And I climbed partway up a small tree to look down at the valley below the rock. And I felt dirt accumulating underneath my fingernails, and my thin knees they hurt from crawling on the dirt. Further and further, closer and closer, with each inch of steps I took. I felt the sun on the back of my neck, and I knew I'd be surely burnt. I was dumbfounded to see a small cottage nestled in the woods. There was a large well from water that was surrounded by purple violets. I saw a small girl dancing in and out of the sunbeams, the lights tickling her coarse hair. Oh, she had piercing blue eyes and a very small framed face. I thought she was enchanting. I thought she was beautiful. She had a small nose and a very high forehead, a long body, and she wore a long brown dress. She had sweet pink lips and long arms hung from her body. She was very tall, but her waist and her face was so small and fragile. I was frozen. I couldn't move a single muscle. The large, frail girl, however, made contact with me. The maiden cocked her head to the side as she was trying to figure out who I was. I locked eyes with her. The girl stared at me and stretched out her long, webbed fingers as if she was catching the sun rays that bounced off the trees. She would look up and she hummed the most beautiful melody, her sweet pink lips. And the melody came alive. It was bouncing off the trees as if it become a being. It had sound. It was everywhere. I was stuck in utter dismay. And then I heard a louder voice come up behind the girl. And he was the owner of the voice, and a large and hairy being grabbed the girl around the waist. The girl went with the large hairy being, and they faded into the trees. I could hear their footsteps. I could hear them singing. I could hear them talking. And I could hear his large footsteps bashing into the ground. I caught the girl looking back at me, and then she faded into the forest. They were gone. My heart thudded as I leaped off the tree, and I ran as fast as I could down the large hill, almost rolling down the hill. And I was slipping and sliding on mud and gunk. And then my heart was beating faster and faster in my ears. And then I heard the distant sounds of laughter behind me. It surrounded me on all sides. What had just happened? Who would ever believe me? Now, I had set out to find a family deep in the woods of Sugarplum Hollow. And I had succeeded, but I couldn't tell a soul until now. And it would be my secret. She and the girl of the Indian rock. I hoped one day to return, but I never did. It appeared that the legend of the Maiden of Sugarplum Hollow was not a legend after all. I never returned to the area. I was much too worried and frightened. However, I will never forget the encounter that I had with that Maiden of Sugarplum Hollow. Thank you for listening. Now, you tell me, was that an urban legend? Is that true or false? Have a beautiful day. Thanks for listening.